Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. On Thursday, a federal judge ordered Steve Bannon to surrender to prison on July 1st. Bannon had been convicted for defying subpoenas related to the January 6th committee's investigation into Trump's insurrection. Maga rage is already exploding over this, with movement influencers describing it as a corrupt effort to disable Bannon through the election and much worse. Notably, Bannon is one of the leading pro-Trump figures calling on Trump to jail a whole range of people on the left without cause if he's elected president. Needless to say, Bannon's jail sentence is only fueling that MAGA mania. Today we're discussing this with the perfect guest. Eric Columbus, a lawyer who represented the House committee investigating Trump's insurrection and who filed an amicus brief against Bannon during his trial. Welcome, Eric.
Glad to be here, Greg.
Okay, Eric, can you walk us through what happened with Bannon and how we got to this point?
Of course. The January 6th committee subpoenaed Bannon to testify and to provide documents about January 6th. Bannon said no and refused to comply at all. The full House of Representatives voted to hold him in contempt of Congress and refer him to DOJ for prosecution. DOJ did, in fact, indict him, initiated prosecution, and he was convicted. And the district court suspended his sentence until he had a chance to appeal. He appealed to the D.C. Circuit. He lost. DOJ went back to the district court and said, hey, it's time to throw him in jail. District court agreed.
And that's where we are right now.
Yep.
I want to share some of the reaction from MAGA leaders. Trump absolutely exploded with fury on Truth Social, spinning out convoluted nonsense about how the January 6th committee committed crimes and calling for them to be indicted. Jack Posobiec, a big MAGA thought leader, tweeted, quote, 80 years after D-Day, our own governments are locking up their political opposition. And here's Charlie Kirk, courtesy of Media Matters.
They're trying to take Steve Bannon out of this election. So this is a top-down, bottom-up great squeeze strategy. Listen carefully. Take Trump out or make him a convicted felon. By the way, his sentencing on July 11th. Don't be surprised if they put him in prison. Take out one of the lieutenants of the MAGA movement, Steve Bannon. Take out Peter Navarro. Take out Tyler Boyer. This is orchestrated. This is coordinated. This is a desperate regime that is trying to take out one of the most important voices.
Eric, when Kirk rails at the desperate regime, of course he means President Biden, Democrats, and law enforcement. What's amazing about this is that in the minds of MAGA, they're simply allowed to break laws without consequence. Any application of the law to them is inherently illegitimate. Bannon broke the law by defying a congressional subpoena. Can you talk about why Bannon's offense was actually a very serious one?
Congress needs information in order to do its job. And that information comes in the form of testimony and in the form of documents. And we often see people trying to play around with Congress. For example, Hunter Biden tried to delay testifying, and Congress was like, look, if you want, we will refer you to the Department of Justice, and they will see whether to prosecute you, because you're going to come in and sit down in that chair. And eventually he complied. And that's what the law requires.
And so to underscore the point, let's talk about why the January 6th committee wanted to hear from Bannon in the first place. Bannon was in touch with Trump in the run-up to January 6th, and he said something like, it's time to kill the Biden presidency in the crib, which sounds like insurrectionist talk. And as MSNBC's Steve Bannon points out, Bannon seemed to know what was going to happen just beforehand, saying that all hell is going to break out. Can you go into a bit of detail about why it was so important for the January 6th committee to hear from Bannon under oath?
I mean, Bannon is a shit stirrer and has been that throughout his career in politics, and was extremely close to President Trump before his departure from the White House in 2017, and regained his position in Trump's good graces by the 2020 campaign. He set himself up in the quote-unquote war room in the Willard Hotel in the days after the election and in the run-up to January 6th. He apparently had extensive communications with President Trump and was really very much an agitator.
Yeah, and I think obviously the January 6th committee would have wanted to know about conversations between Bannon and Trump about this. Maybe Bannon could have testified to Trump's insurrectionist intent in those conversations. Maybe Bannon could have testified to Trump saying something like, you know, we're summoning the mob down here, and if we can't really get our way from Pence, maybe the mob can light a fire under them, so to speak, right? I mean, the whole thing that they really covered up was this kind of link between the insurrectionist mob and Trump's intentions, and anything that could have shed more light on what Trump was thinking in the run-up to January 6th would have really helped the January 6th committee fill in some of the gaps in the picture. And so I think we need to say clearly that Bannon helped Trump cover up the insurrection by refusing to testify. This is a serious thing. Can you talk about that?
Very much so. I mean, Bannon, he was very close to Trump, and at the same time, he really had his pulse on a lot of the extreme groups that were supporting Trump. And having him in the chair and getting his communications would be necessary to holding a complete investigation. It would have been malpractice for the committee not to try to get information from Bannon.
You raise a really important point there, which is that Trump and Bannon would be probably communicating about what was really going on with the groups who were being mobilized. And again, what really had to be nailed down by the committee, I mean, they did a fantastic job of telling the full story, but one piece that kind of has always been elusive was the idea that Trump understood the mob as a weapon to carry out the procedural coup. I think that they've shown that beyond any doubt, and I expect that Special Counsel Jack Smith will prove it beyond any doubt. But having Steve Bannon talk about those communications would have obviously shed some more light on that, don't you think?
I agree. I definitely agree with that. Every communication fleshes out more information. Every communication can possibly lead to more avenues to go down. You see who Bannon is communicating. You want to go after the communications possibly of those people. Of course, many of them would be people who the committee had already identified, but it's certainly possible that others might not have been.
That's interesting. I mean, there are definitely players here that we may not know about. Let's get into another aspect of this. Bannon is one of the leading MAGA people calling on Trump to commit in advance to jailing political opponents. Bannon told Axios that Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who successfully prosecuted Trump, should and will be jailed. Bannon also wrote that there are dozens of ambitious backbencher state attorneys general and district attorneys who need to really step up to this moment, presumably meaning they should find ways to indict Democrats and other designated enemies of the MAGA movement wherever possible. You're a lawyer. Can we talk about what this would actually look like? Trump would need to get the right officials in place at the Justice Department to do this. He'd need prosecutors to go along with the plan. He'd need grand juries to actually serve up indictments, right?
Yes, and the grand jury part is a very large part of that. Prosecutors, we say kind of in shorthand that the DOJ indicted someone. That's not actually how it works. It's technically a grand jury that votes to indict people, just normal citizens who sit and hear the prosecution's case and vote on whether there is a probable cause to indict. And that's an important check in the system.
Right. And so when Steve Bannon says that Alvin Bragg should and will be jailed, I'll tell you, it sounds to me like he's actually cutting grand juries out of the process here. And I want to ask you about this. I feel like nobody's actually asked Steve Bannon and others threatening this kind of thing really good questions about what their actual intent is. I mean, you can't just indict someone without prosecutors and a grand jury agreeing that the evidence against them warrants it. And I don't think they're going to be able to get that, obviously. So I think what Bannon and some of these others are actually talking about is finding ways to jail people on other grounds, on emergency grounds, that kind of thing. You've been a government lawyer. What could something like that look like?
I mean, I can imagine, it seems improbable to me, but I can imagine situations where a new Trump administration would just kind of straight up go and arrest people. And then if and when their release is ordered, the question becomes whether the administration would comply. I like to believe that the administration would, but if they've chosen to go down that route in the first place, it might be because they've opted in certain circumstances not to. I think this is probably what some might call a tail end risk, kind of in the sense of things that are less likely to happen, but that would be devastating if they occurred.
I agree that it's improbable. What I want to stress, though, is that I think this is what Bannon is actually talking about. Does that make sense? It seems to me that what Bannon and Kash Patel really mean when they rant about this kind of stuff, and when they demand these pre-commitments to jailing Dr. Fauci and jailing Biden and jailing Alvin Bragg, what they're talking about is finding ways to put them in jail, whether or not a grand jury actually indicts them. I think that's what they're saying.
I think that's possible. I mean, it's also possible that Bannon is just running his mouth to extract more cash from the people who watch his show. I mean, as we know, Bannon's a fraudster. He's been indicted, and this is his second crime. He was, rather, I should say, it's a second indictment. He was indicted for defrauding MAGA supporters who donated money to a private campaign to build the wall. He was indicted by Trump's DOJ and then pardoned by Trump. Then he was indicted again, I believe, by New York authorities. So Bannon is really in it for the cash, and I think his whole bravado with the January 6th committee may have been just part of that same kind of rebel attitude. And he's going to go to jail unless the Supreme Court bails him out. He's going to go to jail for 4 months, and he might be delighted to do that. So then he comes out and he's got some, additional street cred to his supporters.
I think there's no question that grift is a major, major part of this, right? As you say, he was indicted already for scamming people related to Donald Trump's wall. And I think that when he talks about on his podcast about all these arrests that are coming, there's a major scamming element to that as well. On the other hand, I think it actually awakens in MAGA Nation a real, genuine desire for this to happen. That's what I think is really quite dangerous.
I do think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous in part because of the extra legal pressures that are brought to bear, and that people have to literally watch their back for fear. It takes only one crazy person with an opportunity to kill someone. And as we've seen in other contexts, Trump relies on fear, on inspiring fear in people who are on the border between supporting him or not. We've seen people like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, and Peter Meyer, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, the former Michigan congressman, all talk about how they've heard from colleagues in Congress who were afraid to vote against Trump on impeachment or in related matters because they were afraid that someone would come after them or their families. I mean, these are real fears that have had real consequences in making people too timid to stand up to Trump.
Exactly. The sort of backlash that those Republicans who actually stood up for the rule of law and against Trump and Maga, the sort of backlash that they faced from ordinary Americans who have been really torqued up into an extreme lather by this type of stuff is really what we're talking about here. It's the consequence of this type of Bannon talk. I think even if we very charitably call it just grift, the consequences of it are really extremely dangerous. I mean, we're seeing it right now. January 6th itself showed what can happen when a large enough mob is essentially persuaded that they've got to just do what they have to do in order to prevent the enemy of MAGA, the enemy of Trump, from defeating Trump and the movement. And so January 6th itself stands as, I think, a real very vivid illustration of where this could go if Trump gets in again.
Very much so. It's a bit of a terrifying prospect.
Well, it certainly is. But hopefully Trump will lose the election. And, on the other hand, I was going to say hopefully Trump will lose the election and then we won't have to worry about any of this stuff. But, of course, if there's any lesson from January 6th, it's that when they lose the election, things get even worse. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think that's in terms of possible extremist violence. It is worse when they lose, but in terms of having a robust democracy where public officials are free to do their jobs and free to speak without fear, I think it's much better to win.
Well, absolutely. One more thing about Bannon, if I may. He and Trump have already been saying that the election will be stolen from Trump. They are saying this now, many months in advance, right? They're already laying the groundwork to contest the election violently if they lose it. What they have told their followers over and over and over is that if Trump loses the election, it is an illegitimate outcome. There is no legitimate way for Trump to lose the election. Their followers are being absolutely inundated with this message. Matt Gertz at Media Matters has chronicled how a lot of right-wing media figures are absolutely filling the heads of MAGA Nation with this on a regular basis. I think we're a little bit asleep at the wheel here. We're not really keeping track of what's actually going on the MAGA right on this stuff, and I think we need to.
I think so. Trump was also doing this in 2020, but I agree that the volume is much louder now than it was at this time in 2020. He's saying it just a lot more often. One thing that may point somewhat in the opposite direction is that the prosecutions that by DOJ of people involved in January 6th may very well have a deterrent effect. I mean, people, with the possible exception of Steve Bannon, people in general don't want to go to jail, don't want to go to prison. And there have been opportunities for people to act violently in protests, such as surrounding Trump's indictment and conviction. And instead, we've seen very few Trump supporters even show up. So I think and hope, fingers crossed, that DOJ and the courts and juries showing that there are consequences when you break the law will have some effect on people abiding by the law if and hopefully when Trump loses.
I got to say, there are positive elements to the story. That's one of them. Another is that law enforcement did not hold back from very aggressively going after the January 6th rioters, even though Trump threatened the country with violence if that were to happen. And now Trump has really tried to suggest that there will be outpourings of violence and rage if he's indicted and convicted. That hasn't happened. There weren't protests. Right-wing media tried really hard to create the impression that there was this huge outpouring of fury about Trump's conviction. There wasn't one in real life outside the right-wing media bubble. And so, yeah, there's a positive side to the story, right? The rule of law is proceeding. It's proceeding kind of slowly, but there's one conviction. And I think there's at least a chance we get the January 6th trial starting before the election. And of course, the elephant in the room is that if Trump wins the election, he cancels the prosecutions into himself. But aside from that, and it's a big thing, I'll allow that. But aside from that, the rule of law is proceeding, and the protests aren't coming, and the threats of violence aren't dissuading anybody. That's a positive story, isn't it?
I think it definitely is. That and of course, at the end of the day, whether we entrust the government, put the government in the hands of people who respect the rule of law, it depends on us and what happens on November 5th. I mean, to quote Barack Obama, who in turn, I believe, was quoting a woman whose name I unfortunately forget, we are the ones we've been waiting for. No one is going to save us, but it's up to us.
Indeed. Eric Columbus, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Greg.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.